Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. In this video we're going to cover Warcraft Logs, the strange website packed full of a dizzying array of information. A lot of high-end players use Warcraft Logs to improve themselves, accessing logs in order to figure out what they can do to improve their performance and, of course, their ranking against other players who use the system. To a beginner, Warcraft Logs is utterly baffling. So, let's discuss the website, how to use it, and how to improve yourself. Let's start by going over just what Warcraft Logs is. In essence, the website provides a free service that allows players of World of Warcraft to log time spent in combat, using a program that will save their combat log, including every cast, hit, parry, dodge, mana spent, time spent doing things. Essentially, it turns a fight with a boss into a gigantic sheet of information, and that information can be used by a player to improve. For instance, a spellcaster may look at their log of a fight against a boss, see how many times they cast their most damaging spell, and then compare it to another log from another player that dealt more damage than them, seeing what the other player did differently. They can then take this useful information and change how they play in order to perform better. The value here is that almost every log is public, so you can go and see several different logs for your class, spec, composition, item level, all kinds of different things like that, and you can get a pretty accurate comparison so that you can then use other players' skill to improve. Conversely, if you're doing really well, other players can look at your logs and then improve themselves as well. Now, there are two main aspects of Warcraft Logs, the act of logging combat and the act of examining information. You don't need to know how to use the Warcraft Logs program in order to examine information provided by others, but if you're not in a guild where someone, or indeed several people, use the Warcraft Logs program, then you're going to need to do it yourself. Thankfully, this is nice and simple. Simply go to the Warcraft Logs website, warcraftlogs.com, linked in the description below, make an account, then click Install Client in the top left bar. You'll need to download Adobe Air to install the client, which is available on the same page. Then, install the client. Open it up, sign in, and keep the application open. Head into the game. Hit Escape to open up the game menu. Enter System. Then, go to Network, and check Advanced Combat Logging. This will allow the game to write more in-depth logs for you to use, giving you more information and making your logs eligible for rankings against others. Now you're ready to log. When you type /combat-log into your chat box, the application will begin to keep track of everything that happens around you, as long as you're in combat. It puts this information into a text file. Make sure to find it in Program Files, World of Warcraft, Logs. Then you can type /combat-log again to deactivate logging when you're done. A couple of important notes about logging though. First of all, if you want to log an entire raid night, make sure you activate the combat log at the start of the raid and deactivate it once it ends. Don't stop and start it for each raid boss, trash pull, or break. Keep it active right up until the raid properly ends and the group disbands. The application and website will filter out all of the downtime, so don't worry about that. You want the whole thing down as one log. Secondly, if you want to live log, which is the act of uploading logs directly to Warcraft Logs as you create them, allowing you to examine information in between wipes, then simply use the live log feature provided in the application. If you choose to log normally, you'll need to upload your finished log using the application's upload feature. Find the text file in Program Files, World of Warcraft, Logs, and upload it to access the information. Alright, so the act of logging is actually pretty simple, but understanding the information you've generated is another thing entirely. So, let's use an example and explain what's going on and what you can get out of all of this. On screen now is the log of one of my guild's raids, during which we were able to kill every boss of the Hellfire Citadel on Mythic difficulty. There's a lot of information here, so let's break it down. At the top of the page is the name of the raid, the creator of the log, and when they made it, the name of the guild and the name of the realm, if applicable, and a drop-down menu of other logs made by the creator. Next is the name of the boss, including a drop-down menu that contains links to every other boss, wipes, and kills, also logged by this particular report. It is set by default to show the last pull of the night, either the final wipe or the kill. It also shows what difficulty it was on, how long it took, and when it happened. This too has a drop-down menu, allowing you to select logs of a particular wipe. Also included here is a list of each phase, with its own drop-down menu. This section also has 5 tabs: Analyze, Compare, Problems, Rankings, and Replay. Let's quickly go over what each of these tabs do. Analyze is what it's set to by default. It provides the information of the fight in a form with which to analyze. Compare allows you to search for other logs from other players using a number of different filters and options so that you can find their log for comparison. Problems allows you to see potential issues automatically generated by the website based on the log. It allows you to view who used potions, how many they used, how many used healing tonics, who got hit by avoidable damage, who dealt with certain mechanics, things like that. Rankings is a popular tab that lists who ranked where compared to other players of their class and specialization. The higher the rank percentage, the better. Finally, the Replay tab allows you to see a real-time display of the kill using a map and dots to see how players moved about and the general formation of the raid team as they fought the boss. Side note, this is really cool. These 5 tabs are the things we'll focus on in a bit more detail now. Don't worry, I know this seems very complicated, but in essence, everything we are going to look at is information. It's just information about what happened in combat, when it happened, how it happened, who it happened to, things like that. It's just a bunch of different ways of showing that information. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, feel free to pause and rewind the video at any point, and of course ask questions in the comments if you're a bit confused. It can take time to kind of learn all of this stuff, but it's definitely worth it. The Analyze tab has most of the information you will need. It contains a lot of raw information about the fight. The tabs at the top of this tab, I know there are a lot of tabs, allow you to swap between a summary of the data, damage done by each player, comparing them and showing their raw information, damage taken by each player, the healing done by each player and all of the raw information for that, various important buffs and how much uptime they had, how many debuffs went out and how long they were active, who died, what killed them, and what healing was happening at the time, who interrupted and what spells they interrupted, what dispels were cast, resources and how they changed throughout the fight, and finally, how many spells each player actually cast and how active they were throughout the fight. In summary, you can see a graph of the fight, which can be altered with various filters by clicking on the titles at the top, or through the options menu at the top right. Also here is the raid composition, which uses icons and name coloring to denote class and spec, a quick summary of who did the most damage and healing, and how many deaths there were. Each player name in Warcraft Logs is almost always a link that will allow you to see the statistics for that particular player, allowing you to essentially view the fight through the eyes of that player, creating the aforementioned summary, damage done, taken, healing, buffs, etc. for that particular player rather than the whole raid. You can even change the summary to display enemy information rather than friendly information. Further down in the summary, you can see a list of the damage done, sorted in order of who dealt the most damage. You can see their name, again a link, the percentage of the raid's damage they dealt, the exact number, their damage per second, and you can click on the plus symbol to add that player's damage as a graph, otherwise known as a pin, to the summary. After that is the healing done box, which is just like the damage done box, but for healing. You can see names, percentage healing done, the exact amount, healing per second, and you can hit the plus symbol to add the player's healing as a graph. Next, we have the damage taken by ability box, which shows how much damage was done by enemies throughout the fight, in order of most damaging. Again, it has the names of abilities, the percentage, the exact amount, damage taken per second, and a plus symbol to add it as a graph. Finally, in the summary tab, we have deaths. This box shows who died, what killed them, when in the fight they died, and again, there's a plus symbol to add this as a graph. In the second tab, Damage Done, we have a large graph of the overall damage done by the raid, which again can be filtered to show various things through the titles at the top and the options menu. Under that is the Damage Done table. This shows everyone's damage from top to bottom damage. Again, each name is a link which will take you to a breakdown of that player's damage by ability. You can see a percentage for their performance, higher is better, the percentage of the raid's damage the player dealt, a bar that denotes the sources of their damage, Mouse over this to see a breakdown of their damage versus their pets, totems, and guardians' damage, the exact damage the player dealt, their item level, their performance compared to their item level, where a higher percentage is better, how active they were in the fight, i.e. how often they were actually casting spells or using abilities, which you want to be as close to 100% as possible, what the player's active damage per second was, and what their effective damage was. Active damage calculates their damage based upon how active they were throughout the fight, and effective damage calculates their damage based upon the length of the fight. So, if a player dealt high damage for most of a fight and then died, their effective DPS would be lowered because they're not dealing damage for that portion of the fight. But their active DPS would remain high, because while they were active, they were dealing high damage. Again, you can add these to the graph by clicking on the plus symbol. You can hit copy at the bottom to put the table onto your clipboard, which you can then paste into a spreadsheet program to examine further. And you can use the CSV and PDF buttons to save the sheet as either of those formats. Now that we've examined the damage done tab, we can speed through the others because they all really have the same layout. Damage taken works exactly the same way, showing the same information but for the damage that players take. Expect your tanks to be pretty high on this list. Healing is the same, showing all the information for healing, healing done, healing per second, etc. The buff tab shows a large number of important buffs for players, such as Elemental Fusion and Lightning Vortex, how many times they're cast, and what their uptime is. Just note that some constant buffs, like Shadow Form or Slice and Dice, are also included here. If you scroll down, you can also see defensive buffs, healing buffs, movement buffs, raid buffs, and stances. Debuffs, similarly, detail the various debuffs that hit the raid. The count number here is most likely what you'll be after when examining this page. Deaths will show how people died in a little more detail, including when they died, what killed them, how long it took to kill them, what the last 3 hits were, how much damage they took from the killing blow, and how much healing they received during the time it took them to die. You can mouse over each of these to see a breakdown of the sources. Moving on to interrupts. This shows what spells were interrupted, who by, and what percentage of the spellcasts were interrupted by what player. The graph also shows when the interrupts occurred. Dispels are, as you would imagine, a list of what spell was dispelled, who by, how many each player dispelled, the percentage of casts that were dispelled, what dispels were missed, who the target of the spell was, and what time they were missed, if they were missed at all. The resources section shows a graph of how resources change throughout the fight, and can be changed and filtered like other graphs. This will show things like holy power, focus, runic power, things like that. Finally, casts show the number of abilities used by each player, again sorted by who cast the most. It details names, the percentage of casts done by each player, the exact number, their item level, how active each player was, what their active casts per minute were, and what their effective casts per minute were. Moving down the page, we find more ways to filter and display the information in the tabs we just covered. On the left, you can find the sources and names to show particular information for a player. For instance, if I change the name here to Conto Canis, the name of my character, the graph will change to show the damage done, damage taken, healing done, and healing received for just that character. I can then use the options on the graph to filter the information and get at what I want to know. This option doesn't change much for each tab, allowing you to filter whose eyes you want to look at the information through. In fact, you can go between each tab and the filter won't reset. Simply hit the X at the top left next to the name to reset the graph to show all. To the right of this filter are 4 more tabs. Hooray! More tabs. Here you can look at a table, which is the default way of looking at information and, in my opinion, the most helpful. A timeline, which will show the information under the graph as a large timeline with everyone lined up. Events, which is essentially a combat log. And queries, which allows you to create custom graphs, also known as pins, using a wide variety of filters. You can add filters for just about anything, from damage, healing, buffs, dispels, deaths, casts, crits, multi-strikes, and much more. You can then filter the query with the names of the characters, sources, targets, and even abilities. You can copy the pin into a string, bookmark it for later use, and hit Create Pin to add it as a graph to the report. A good example of using a query to find something specific is to use the filters to find how much damage was dealt by a particular ability. For instance, my Chain Lightning spell, throughout the entirety of the fight. The graph shows not only the DPS dealt by my Chain Lightning, but it also shows when I cast it throughout the fight. Moving on to the graph and what we can do to filter and show information using it. The default summary graph will show the per second amount of damage done, damage taken, healing done, and healing received throughout the fight. Let's start with the options menu drop-down at the top right. Here there are a few filtering options. You can choose to hide the entire graph if you don't want to use it, add or remove heroism, which will display a translucent section to the graph which denotes when bloodlust or heroism was cast. You can add player deaths, which will use red lines to show when players died, and you can add player resurrections to show when battle reses are used. You can add in the time the boss dies, and you can add in when NPCs die. This is very helpful for seeing when certain adds are killed. Finally, you can use the Show All Entries and Hide All Entries button to show or hide the aforementioned per second amounts of damage done, taken, healing done, and healing received. The graph itself will show lines that move up and down to denote the rising and falling of damage and healing. You can hover your mouse over the lines to get more detail about the exact numbers for each moment. If you've added in extra information, such as when players die and are resurrected, mousing over the point where the graph's line meets the moment will detail the exact time where a player died, what they died from, who resurrects them, and with what ability. A really cool feature of this graph is that you can zoom in to various sections of it to see in better detail what's happening. For instance, if I enable NPC deaths and want to see in more detail exactly when they died, I can zoom in. To do this, simply hold the left mouse button and drag over a section of the fight. Once you release the mouse button, the graph will zoom in, creating a replacement graph that details only that particular section of the fight. Notice that at the top of the screen, the All Phases button now has a number that denotes what parts of the fight you're examining. You can hit Reset Zoom to return the graph to its default state. Just remember that everything you do with this graph is saved through the various tabs, so you can jump to healing or deaths, and the graph will still display when NPCs died, and the graph will still remain at a certain time period unless you reset it. Moving down to the summary table, here we have a couple of options. First, you can input a number to ignore events, essentially to stop providing information after a certain number of people have died. This is very helpful for figuring out what killed players in a wipe, since at a certain point the raid leader is going to call for people to die quickly, so you want to know who died because they made a mistake, and who died intentionally because a wipe was called. You can use the ignore events after X players have died field to do just this. Just hit enter once you've typed in a number to activate it. Filter expressions, on the other hand, are incredibly complex and use an expression language for experts and programmers to build huge queries. As beginners, we don't need to mess with this, so instead, let's move on. Now that we've covered everything in the Analyze tab, which is by far the biggest tab, so the rest of these will go pretty quickly, let's move on to the Compare tab. The Compare tab opens up an options menu that allows you to search for other logs in order to compare them with your own. At the top, we can change the name of the fight we want to compare. Next, we can choose to directly compare the log with another by pasting in the code in the URL of another log if we have a specific comparison in mind. Or, we can do a search for logs similar to ours. You can select which player you want to search for comparisons to, how long compared logs should be in terms of fight length. Fights that are similar in length are good for comparisons, since cooldowns and spellcasts should be roughly the same. You can choose the difference in raid size to compare with, useful for normal or heroic logs. You can choose item level differences, and the time range, to compare with recent logs rather than older ones. Then, from the drop-down menu, you can choose what metric to search for: damage, healing, survivability, or default performance rankings. Once you hit search, you'll be granted a list of players who have logs comparable to your own, ranked in order of their performance. You can see their rank, their name, their guild, their realm, their item level, their damage per second, the date of the log, the duration of the fight, how similar a match they are in terms of abilities and the damage those abilities dealt, a link to their armory page, and a compare button which you can use to import that particular log into your own. When you do so, a new tab will open in your browser that will allow you to do a side-by-side comparison of both yourself and the log you're comparing to. You can use the Analyze tabs and graphs just as we discussed earlier, but this time you'll have 2 times the information, allowing you to compare damage, healing, damage taken, casts, resources, things like that. This is great for improving. Next up is the Problems tab. This is an automated list of potential problems generated by Warcraft Logs, allowing you to examine basic issues that your raid team may be facing. At the top is the same graph that shows damage, damage taken, healing done, and healing received, with the same options as earlier. The Problems table is where the juicy information is stored. At the top of the table is a short piece of lore taken straight from the Dungeon Journal and a link to the Wowhead strategy guide. Next, it shows your raid's average item level and a minimum average item level required to beat the boss. Next is a table of potion usage. This shows how many potions each player has used. Since these are damage increases, there should ideally be 2 uses per player, once right before the fight begins to reset the cooldown, and at another point during the fight, preferably during Bloodlust, but not always. Next is the Healthstone and Healing Tonic use table, which shows how many players used a healing tonic during the fight. In theory, everyone should use a healing tonic once per fight, but in practice, it's very rarely necessary to use one of these in anything other than hard progression or in emergencies, so don't expect everyone to always use one. Next up is the Avoidable Damage tab, which starts with a list of icons and names for each source of avoidable damage, defaulted to all of these sources. You can click each icon for a breakdown of who got hit by what ability. Included here is a list of each player that got hit, the damage they took from the ability, and how many times they were hit. It also includes a short description from the Dungeon Journal about how the ability works. Some abilities may not have descriptions, as the Dungeon Journal can sometimes lack ability descriptions. Also included are how many players died from each source of damage, and when they died. Moving on, we see several tables dedicated to particular abilities, breaking down the damage taken from each ability. Since these will be different based upon which fight you're doing, and they come with helpful paragraphs of text to explain how each ability works, we'll not go over everything. Needless to say, it includes pertinent information for every ability, including duration, killing blows, how many hits players took, how much enemies healed, things like that. Next up, the Rankings tab. This is where most players will immediately jump to, as it shows the rankings of each player compared to others of their class and specialization. Thankfully, it's also fairly simple. Ranking is broken up into percentiles. Basically, Warcraft Logs tallies up and averages every log and ranks them. The higher your percentile, the closer to the top you are, the better you have performed. So if you have a 95th percentile, that means you're in the top 5% of players. But if you have a 10% percentile, you're in the big crowd of players. Percentiles are split into grey, which is very low ranking, in the low 20th percentile, green, which is low ranking, in the 20th to 40 percentile, blue, which is average, in the 40th to 70th percentile, purple, which is good, in the upper 70th to 95th percentile, and orange, which is the top 5% of players for a class, in the 95th to 100th percentile. The first of the 3 tables here is the execution ranking, which determines the team's rank based upon how many deaths they had, how much avoidable damage they took, and how long important enemies were alive for. After that is the speed ranking table, how quickly the team defeated the boss. Then we have the main player rankings by spec table. This is the one that most people look at. Here we have the rank percentage, which shows the percentile of each player. Then we have the rank, the closer to 1 this is, the better. After that is the out of column, which shows how many logs of that class and spec are available and valid, i.e. that haven't exploited the game or are incredibly old, to rank against it. It then shows you the player's best rank, which may not be the same as their current rank. Then you have the name of the player, the DPS they dealt, their item level, the item level bracket that they're a part of, and their percentile in the item level bracket that they're in. Expect this one to be much lower than the default rank percentage. You can go between the damage tab, healing tab, weighted damage tab, which basically tries to compensate for players padding meters and reward them for doing encounters correctly, and changes their ranks based upon that. Finally, you can go to the tank survivability tab, which is experimental as of this video, to get an idea of how the tanks are surviving damage and how they rank against other players. Finally, we have the replay tab. This is a new and experimental feature of Warcraft Logs that will play the fight out in real time, or sped up if you want, and show the movement of players and enemies on a map version of the environment. At the top, you can filter out players and enemies by clicking on their names. At the bottom left, you can change what information you're seeing: damage done, damage taken by ability, healing done, and healing received. These will change just like a damage meter in the game. Then, in the bottom right, you have the raid's health, including important buffs and debuffs. In the replay itself, you can click and drag to move the map around, and you can zoom in and out with the mouse wheel. At the bottom of this screen, you can drag the buffer bar just like you might a YouTube video. You can play or pause the replay, filter out players, pets, bosses and NPCs in bulk, change the speed of the replay, add or remove raid markers or meters, and even watch a video that's been linked to the kill, although you're not likely to have one of these. You can even add queries to create graphs, again known as pins, to the top of the replay to compare them to the actual replay. Finally, you can also full screen the replay for your viewing pleasure or to see things in more detail. Alright, so we've gone over exactly what information is available to use in Warcraft Logs. As you can see, there's a lot of it. Now, let's discuss how we can use this information to improve ourselves. If you haven't watched the section pertaining to the information available in Warcraft Logs, and you're not familiar with it, this section might be a touch confusing. So I suggest taking the time to examine that section first. We'll be covering a damage dealing role, since figuring out healing and tanking improvement is very similar to that. You just have to search for health per second rather than damage per second, or damage taken per second. You're still going to be dealing with things like how often you used an ability versus how often someone else used an ability, how much damage they took versus how much damage you took, how much healing you did at a certain point when you're using a cooldown based upon how much healing they did at a certain point using a certain cooldown. That and damage dealing is much more common than healing or tanking, so hopefully this will cover kind of most people. So let's discuss how you can improve your damage using logs. Before we begin, let's figure out exactly what damage is. What determines your damage? How do you deal more of it? Well, you deal damage by using abilities, and those abilities deal varying amounts of damage and are often limited by something. For example, as an elemental shaman, my big source of single target damage is Lava Burst. It is limited by its cooldown. So, the more times I use Lava Burst, the more times it can go on cooldown and be available again, the more times I can cast it. The more times I cast it, the higher damage I deal. This is exactly the same for something that takes, say, holy power or combo points. The more resource you generate, the more often you can use your big abilities, the more damage you deal. Similarly, for a big cooldown like Fire Elemental Totem, which deals heavy damage but is again restricted by a long cooldown, the more often I use it in a fight, the more times it can appear to deal its damage, the more damage I'll deal overall. Ascendance with a 2-minute cooldown allows me to do heavy single target damage, so the more times I use Ascendance in a fight, the more single target damage I'm going to do. This might seem pretty simple, but a lot of people forget that this is where damage comes from. This is why you want to use cooldowns at or near the start of a fight to get more uses out of them. This might seem really simple, but a lot of people forget that this is where the damage metric comes from. It's at least one of the aspects of it, so try and keep that in mind. Okay, so we deal more damage by using abilities more often. But how else can we deal more damage? Well, we want those abilities to hit as hard as they can, so we want to increase our damage dealt while casting high damage abilities. For instance, my Lava Burst will hit harder when my weapon enchantment, Mark of the Frostwolf, has activated, as it gives it a higher chance to multi-strike for bonus damage. Similarly, if I use a Dranic Intellect Potion, I gain a temporary increase to my intellect, which means my spells will deal more damage. On the flip side of this, bosses can also take more damage at certain points as well. So we deal more damage by using abilities more often and having damage increases active when we use those abilities. Similarly, we gain damage increases when we gain haste bonuses, which allows us to cast faster, swing faster, and have lower global cooldowns. So, the damage you deal is dependent upon 3 main points. Are you prioritizing your abilities correctly and using the right spell at the right time? Are you using your best abilities as often as possible? And Are you using damage increases in tandem with one another to not only get the most uses out of them, but to synergize to deal more damage? Well, we can find those answers in our logs, and in logs that others post. Let's use Mythic Archimonde as an example, the same example we've been using in this video so far. If you have a log you want to examine, now is the time to get it ready. We start in the default summary page. Go to the Compare tab at the top. We'll be searching for other logs, so hit Select a Player and find yourself. You can leave the fight length, raid size, item level, and time range all on their defaults for this. Select damage as your metric. Then, search. You're going to want to select the log from the best player, which will be at the top of the list. Press the Compare button, and you'll get a new tab that compares the two logs. Now, before we do anything else, let's start by dealing with the fact that this other fellow's log is in Korean. This is kind of common, so a translate button will help tremendously. Thankfully, there's one on the top right. Press that and you'll get a translated version of their logs for your comparison. As a side note, this fellow's name, when put into Google Translate, means peel the bottom of the sphere. So we'll just call him Sphere for this example. Okay, so now we're at the Summary tab with our two logs side by side, and already we have a bunch of useful information available to us. But rather than just start looking at things randomly, let's actually search for useful parts of information. That's the rule of Warcraft Logs. Search for specifics. Looking at the bigger picture will only overwhelm you. Let's try to answer our three questions, starting with, are we prioritizing our abilities correctly and using the right spell at the right time? Let's start by identifying what our main sources of damage were. Just under the summary graph, we have damage done by ability. My top three casting abilities, rounding up, are Lava Burst at 18% of my damage, Flame Shock at 18% of my damage, and Earthquake at 10% of my damage. Molten Earth is a passive ability that I have no direct control over while in a fight, so let's ignore that for now. Do this for yourself, identify the three main sources of damage. Now, let's compare it with our friend Sphere. His top three sources of damage were Lava Burst at 18%, Flame Shock at 17%, and Earthquake at 15%. So, a very similar percentage of our damage done was done by those three spells. Even if the damage dealt by those spells was different, the percentage was almost identical, save for Earthquake. This suggests that we're playing similarly to Sphere, which is a good thing, because he's the best on Warcraft Logs right now. However, there are differences here. His Earthquake dealt about 5% more of his overall damage than ours did. His Molten Earth dealt about 2% less of his damage than ours, and his Fulmination dealt 3% more damage than ours. Let's think about why that is. Clearly, his Earthquakes were stronger than ours, as they dealt nearly double the damage. They must have been active on more targets than I was. My Molten Earth dealt more damage because right now, I'm geared with more Mastery gear than normal, as I've swapped over from being a healer. So, that suggests I should start looking for less Mastery and more Multi-Strike. But the general conclusion here is that yes, we are using the right spell at the right time. There are no major issues here. There are just a couple of tweaks we can do. Question number 2. Are we using our best abilities as often as possible? Well, to find that out, let's go to the Damage Done tab and look at the casts for our best abilities, starting with Lava Burst. I cast mine 85 times throughout the fight, and it hit 86 times. Sphere cast Lava Burst 104 times and hit 102 times, so he got in a good 20 more Lava Bursts than I did, suggesting that I need to keep an eye on my Lava Burst cooldown and make sure to use it more often, as it's a big part of my damage dealt. Even though one of my mechanics is to kind of randomly give me a free Lava Burst every now and then, that's tied to the use of Flame Shock, which we'll be looking at next, and that kind of chance might allow for a little bit of divergence here, but a good 20 Lava Bursts cannot all be thanks to luck. My Lava Bursts multi-struck 83.1% of the time, and his multi-struck 83.8% of the time, so there's no problem there. Now let's look at Flame Shock. We want this spell to be up nearly 100% of the time. That's what you want with any kind of damage over time spell, you want 100% uptime. I cast my Flame Shock 13 times throughout the fight. It dealt periodic damage 210 times, and I had a 99.36% uptime, reduced from 100% because the first couple of seconds of the fight, I'm casting Lava Burst, not Flame Shock. That's just part of the rotation, so that's fine. Sphere cast Flame Shock 8 times, but it hit 243 times, with a 99.26% uptime. So our uptime is fine, But we may have been actually recasting the spell too many times, using it on enemies that die quickly, or overwriting the Flame Shock and not getting the most out of it. How can we confirm this though? Well, let's see how much damage our Flame Shock dealt to the various targets of the fight by mousing over it. Okay, 87% of my Flame Shock damage was at Archimonde, with 8% on the Hellfire Deathcallers, and a smaller percentage on other adds. Now, looking at Sphere's Flame Shock damage, 84% of it was on Archimonde, but 5% more of his Flame Shock damage was on the Hellfire Deathcallers than mine. This shows that even though he cast less Flame Shocks, his were more impactful. He also didn't Flame Shock any of the other kinds of adds. I can take away from this that I should probably hold back on using Flame Shock, saving it only for the Hellfire Deathcallers, like Sphere is doing. Next, Earthquake. Here, I cast it 44 times and it hit 270 times. Sphere cast his Earthquake 53 times, and it hit 543 times. That is a big disparity. Clearly the issue here is that my Earthquakes are not hitting enough targets, because even though Sphere has nearly a fifth more casts of the spell than I do, his hits are over double. This suggests that I should be placing my Earthquakes much more carefully, so that they can hit more targets, rather than just throwing them out whenever available. It might be an idea then to wait while I'm moving instead of casting the free Earthquake. Instead, I can put the Earthquake down when I'm done moving and the adds are done moving so that it can deal more damage. Alternatively, there may be a different technique they're using here. But with that big of a disparity, there's clearly something going on here. Finally, Chain Lightning. Let's take a look at that and the results of its casts. I used it 25 times, and it hit 79 times since it bounces. Sphere cast it 56 times and it hit 135 times. He's more than doubled me here. On top of that, I cast Earthshock 47 times and he cast it 66 times, and so he hit with Fulmination 66 times as well, to my 47. This puts him much further ahead on the damage scale. I say this because all of this links together. More Chain Lightning casts means higher Fulmination damage because you're generating more Lightning Shield stacks. And that, combined with his lower use of Flame Shock, means he's using those cooldowns on Earthshock rather than Flame Shock, and getting himself more damage from doing so. Overall, I should be casting Lava Burst more often, placing my Earthquakes more carefully, reducing the amount of Flame Shocks I cast by only using it on 2 of the enemies rather than a lot of them, and making those Flame Shocks more impactful by casting them on enemies that are alive for longer and using them maybe a touch earlier to get more value out of them, and using the time I save from Flame Shocking less on casting more Earth Shocks. I should also make sure I start replacing my Lightning Bolt casts with Chain Lightning casts, and focusing a little bit more on dealing AoE damage than I am single target damage. The final question here is, are we using our damage increases in tandem with one another to not only get the most uses out of them, but to synergize to deal more damage? This isn't something that you absolutely need Warcraft Logs to do, because you can kind of just figure out using your instincts how often to use a cooldown. That's how I've been doing it. But to have a look at this, let's go into the Casts tab and look for our cooldowns. I have Ascendance and Fire Elemental Totem as my big abilities, so let's look at how often I cast them. I used Ascendance 4 times, Berserking, my racial, 3 times, and Fire Elemental Totem once. This may seem strange, but considering that I used Fire Elemental Totem before the fight began, the log isn't registering that first cast. So in reality I used the totem twice. Let's compare this to Sphere's. He cast Ascendance 4 times, Blood Fury, his racial, 4 times, and Fire Elemental Totem once. Since Blood Fury has a 2-minute cooldown to Berserking's 3, we've confirmed that we've been using our big abilities as often as possible. But what about when we're using these abilities? To find out, let's go to the top of the Casts tab to the graph. At the top, we have a list of abilities cast with the names of players in parentheses. Using the arrows, let's scroll down and uncheck all of the active filters so that the graph is empty. Now, let's find Ascendance. Since it's alphabetical, it'll be near the top. You can do this with your own big cooldowns as well. I've activated the filters for both mine and Sphere's Ascendance casts. Now it shows when either of us cast the spell. The first cast has us both using it within the first 3 seconds of the fight. The next cast is at the 2 minute and 9 second mark for Sphere, and 2 minutes and 15 seconds for myself. This likely has a lot to do with how adds were spawning, which is linked to the damage of the overall raid, and their technique. You'll see a similar pattern here. I use my Ascendance a little later than Sphere, to the point where I use it right before the boss dies, not getting the most use out of it. So, moving that last Ascendance back a little would help. Now, let's discover if we're using our Ascendance as well as Sphere, and we'll zoom into the graph to do this. Let's look at what was cast during the first Ascendance. Since the spell lasts 15 seconds, we'll start by dragging from the 30-second mark to the start of the fight. Notice that this changes both the graph and the tables underneath it. Now let's get an exact time frame. Since we both cast Ascendance at approximately the 3-second mark, I'll drag from 3 seconds up to 18, which would be the duration of the Ascendance. During this time, I cast Lava Burst 11 times, and he cast it 9 times. I also cast one more Earth Shock. This may well be thanks to Berserking, which increases my haste, and a lucky proc with my 2-set tier 18 bonus. So my first Ascendance was well spent. Now, we'll reset the zoom at the top and repeat this process for the second Ascendance. He casts his at 2 minutes 9 seconds, so I'll go from 2:30 down. Then I'll zoom in from 2 minutes 9 seconds to 2 minutes 24 seconds to see how he spent his second Ascendance. During this time, he cast 6 Lava Bursts, 6 Earth Shocks, 1 Unleash Flame, and 1 Flame Shock. He was clearly trying to refresh his Flame Shock at this point, but that's not something you generally want to do during Ascendance. So this is in fact an example of a mistake made by another player who is better than me that I should take into consideration. When you're looking at other players' logs, remember that everyone makes mistakes. You don't always want to copy everything that they do. Besides, that's impossible because every raid group is different. Remember, these are guidelines, not specific rules for you to follow. Now, I'm going to reset the graph and go from about 3 minutes to 2:15, where I cast my second Ascendance. Then I'll narrow it down to 2:15 to 2:30 for the duration of my second Ascendance. During this time, I cast Earthquake 8 times, Lava Beam 6 times, Earth Shock once, and Unleash Flame once. A second zoom in to around 2 seconds later suggests that I use the Unleash Flame for movement, not for reapplying Flame Shock. Okay, so I focused on dealing AoE damage during my Ascendance, while he focused on dealing single target damage. But who got more out of their Ascendance? To find out, let's go over to the Damage Done tab. The graph and table will still be edited to show information only during the time frame we specified. Looking at the damage I dealt here by disabling Sphere's line on the graph, we can see that in the 15 seconds Ascendance was up, I dealt a total of 3.27 million damage, with Earthquake dealing most of it. Now, let's go back to the casts. Reset the zoom, enable only Ascendance on the graph again, and zoom back to 2 minutes 9 seconds and 2 minutes 24 seconds, to get the duration of Sphere's Ascendance once more. I'll hop back over to the Damage Done tab and see that during his Ascendance he dealt 3.39 million damage, slightly more than me. But a big chunk of that is coming from a Nithramus, which is the legendary ring. Since I have no control over when we use our ring, as it's part of our strategy, we should consider this as a moot point. So if we take away that damage, we can see that our Ascendance dealt much more damage, so we were using our spells correctly during it, but with good ring timing, Sphere was able to beat us here. What can we take out of this? Unfortunately, not all that much, since he's dealing with a different situation to us, and this is a good example of how Warcraft Logs can sometimes be misleading. You need to go into a lot of detail here to get these little nuggets of information, but they can be very helpful. Just be careful that you don't reason your way into an erroneous fact. The best way to deal with this is to talk with someone else who is familiar with logs and ask what they think of the situation. Now, I can continue going on like this for a long time, going over how I used each ability compared to the best of the best, and getting small little nuggets of information for improving myself. This is the kind of thing a Mythic Raider is expected to do, so whilst it may seem a touch pointless if you're not hugely into raiding, if you want to be the best that you can be, this is the sort of process you should go through. Take your time, take notes about ways you've found to improve yourself, and run your results by someone else to make sure they make sense. Yes, it can be boring, but it's also extremely helpful. And once you get your rotation mastered, once you're kind of feeling like you're at the ceiling of your skill, Warcraft Logs is probably the next step for you to take. Plus, the ability to read information is just kind of useful in general. At the end of the day, you'll defeat your foes and grow stronger as a player thanks to math. And that really is the ultimate expression of being a nerd, wouldn't you say? Thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and found it helpful. If you have any questions, thoughts, comments, or suggestions, you can contact me using the links in the description, or you can just leave a comment. Thank you very much for watching, and I wish you the best of luck in the world of Warcraft.